Blind Citizens Australia proudly presents the An Eye to the Future Job Ready Workshop Series. Disclosing with Confidence. Hosted by Blind Citizens Australia.
Before we do get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. As we gather for this physically dispersed meeting, let's take a moment to reflect upon the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we gather today. Welcome to the people who have just joined us. With me today, I have Bettina, the project manager for An Eye to the Future, and Claire, my colleague and project officer with An Eye to the Future. So welcome to Bettina and Claire, and they will be presenting throughout today's session. An Eye to the Future is an initiative from Blind Citizens Australia funded through the DSS that recognises the career potential of people who are blind or vision impaired. We support job seekers with job readiness activities, including resume and cover letter preparation, the job search, interview preparation, and one-to-one discussions about the topic we're going to be covering today, which is disclosure. We also support employers to think differently about their recruitment and support employers to employ someone who's blind or vision impaired. We support employers on things such as an accessible recruitment process, education and awareness for teams, assistive technology and information about assistive technology. And when an employer does employ someone who's blind or vision impaired through An Eye to the Future, we check in with the employer and the employee as they settle into the workplace. In today's workshop, we will be discussing the topic of disclosure, starting with your rights in the workplace, your choice of how and when to disclose, disclosure language, and finally, some steps on how to create your own disclosure script. But firstly, disclosure is a highly personal topic. You have no legal obligation to tell your employer about your disability. However, in some situations, it may be practical to tell them. For example, if you need changes made to your work environment to help you work safely and productively. And in today's workshop, we're not here to tell you exactly what to say. We're not here to tell you what to do, only to give you some tools and pointers so that if and when you choose to disclose, you have a little more confidence behind you. Disclosure can happen in many different settings. And today we're going to be focusing on the work and job interview context. However, the same principles that we discussed today might apply to other areas of your life too. Take the tools that are right for you. We're going to be providing you with or talking you through a toolkit today. Take what's right for you and just consider what we're saying. We're not telling you that you have to do exactly what we're telling you to do. But before we dive into the how, let me introduce you to our first speaker, our project manager, Bettina. Bettina, over to you.
Thank you, Maddie, and welcome to everyone. It's great to be a part of this workshop this morning, and I look forward to hearing both from Maddie and Claire as well. I'm going to speak about an employer's responsibilities and strategies when an applicant or an employee discloses a disability. So when an applicant or an employee discloses at any time, an employer must provide verbal and written information about the workplace policies, processes, and support services for employees with any disability. And when it comes to asking about the disability at work, the employer must only ask in the work context. Asking the applicant or the employee whether they need adjustments to the selection process and on how to do the job, and if so, about what type of adjustments are required. The employer must not ask for personal information that is not relevant to the position and provide the applicant or the employee specific reasons for why you need to ask disability-related questions. In considering their ability to do the job, the employer must not assume that they cannot do the job because of their disability and must not exclude an applicant or an employee based on the disability. They must only consider whether the person could perform the inherent requirements of the job with workplace adjustments and do this in collaboration with the applicant or the employee. So when it comes to making adjustments, the employer must make a list of adjustments needed to allow the person to participate equitably in the selection process and or carry out the essential duties of the role. The employer must organise and oversee that necessary adjustments are made with reasonable timeframes and keep the applicant and or the employee informed of the process and the adjustments. If the employer is declining a request for a reasonable adjustment, the employer must, under the Disability Discrimination Act, demonstrate that the adjustment would constitute unjustifiable hardship to the organisation or company. Handling of personal information. The employer must treat information about an applicant or employee's disability confidentially. No information can be shared without express consent from the applicant or the employee. Sharing information about the applicant or employee's adjustments, not their disability, the adjustments, with only people who need to make the necessary adjustments or who will be directly affected by the arrangements. So when an applicant discloses during the application process, an employer must ensure that all potential candidates can access the position information. They must provide information in a range of accessible formats. They must accept the application in various formats. They must shortlist according to job suitability, not disability, and focus on capacity to fulfil inherent job requirements. The employer must ask all applicants whether they need any adjustments to the interview process and implement those reasonable adjustments. They must host all interviews in the same accessible location. Also, they must provide precise information about the interview arrangements and share information about the adjustments only with those who need to know. They must remind the interview panel to consider the applicant based on merit. When an applicant discloses at interview, the employer must make adjustments to the interview process if needed, for example, extra time, rearrange the setting, and they must ask the applicant whether they need adjustments to the interview or to do the job, and if so, ask about the type of adjustments required. The employer must not ask for personal information that is not relevant to the position. They again must remind the interview panel to consider an applicant based on the merit, not the disability, and they must be considerate in their approach and language, treat all applicants consistently, and avoid using louder voice or ask before providing assistance. When an applicant or an employee discloses during offer or throughout employment, they must ask the employee directly about how their disability affects them at work and discuss reasonable workplace adjustments. They must implement those reasonable adjustments. The employer must seek further advice if adjustments would constitute unjustifiable hardship, and the employer must ensure terms and conditions are the same for all employees. For example, salary, duties, performance requirements. They must promote, as an employer, they must promote, transfer, train, and terminate according to skills and talent only. Thanks, Maddie. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bettina, for talking us through all of that. And as Bettina mentioned, that this could happen at various stages of the process, either before interview, during the interview, or at the acceptance stage, or it could also happen after. And what we're talking through today is a verbal form of disclosure that would often happen within the interview time. So I'm going to hand over to Claire, our project officer. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Maddie and Bettina. And thank you, Bettina, for talking to us about the rights around disclosure in the workplace from an employer's perspective. So as Maddie said, we're going to now talk about disclosure using a disclosure script. And we're going to look at the use of positive language during this process. So, as has been mentioned before, it's important just to recap quickly that the how and when of disclosure is a personal choice, and disclosure can happen at many opportunities during the recruitment and employment process. And this can happen in written or verbal format. And just for the purpose of this workshop, we're going to think about disclosure in a verbal format at the interview stage. So perhaps the first thing to highlight is, why would you disclose to your employer? And really there are two main reasons for disclosure. And the first is to request and receive the supports that you need to be able to perform the particular role that you're applying for. And the second reason is that a disclosure and the use of a disclosure script and the use of positive language is a really effective and appropriate way of self-advocating. So, as I said, one tool that we can use around the disclosure process is the disclosure script. So, a disclosure script is a pre-prepared and rehearsed simple overview of your vision. It names some supports or adjustments that would be helpful in the workplace for you to effectively perform your role. It focuses very much on your strengths, and the disclosure script can help employers to understand how they can best support you within the environment. So a disclosure script can help to support you to disclose your vision and to give the employer confidence in a way that it gives you opportunity to firstly control it gives you an opportunity to control the disclosure process, so that how and when. It gives you an opportunity to disclose the narrative around your capabilities. And part of that can be challenging those misconceptions that an employer may have about a person who is blind or has low vision in the workplace. It also gives an opportunity to build positive relationships with your employer, so through that open communication. And when you disclose with confidence, it gives your employers confidence in you and gives them an opportunity to follow your lead. Another benefit of using a disclosure script is that it can help you to be prepared for any questions that an employer may have around your vision and the adjustments that you need for the role that you're applying for. So Maddie is now going to speak to us about the use of positive language when disclosing to our employer. Over to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Claire. So when we're talking about a disclosure script, or when we're talking in general, there's more than one way to access information. There's more than one way to say the same thing, depending on the context, the situation, who, what, where. There's many different things that will influence our disclosure. But when we're talking about our vision, can we talk about our disclosure from a strengths perspective? Rather than saying, I can't, can we replace it with, I can, or I am learning? And I'm going to give you a few examples that might be maybe a little surprising, but stay with me for a moment. For example, I can't drive a car. Could we try saying, I can get from A to B with my dog guide, changing I can't to something that I can do that's going to meet some of the requirements of the role? Instead of saying, I had an operation and they messed it up and I lost my vision, try, I had a medical condition that taught me how to approach people and situations in a different way. Instead of saying, I can't use Excel or computer programs, could we say, I'm learning how to use the Microsoft Office suite. I'm learning how to use my computer. I'm learning, and I'm interested to know what functions would be required for the role. And before we move on to the how-to of creating our disclosure script, some questions to consider for ourselves. How do I refer to my vision impairment or blindness? Is it person first? I am a person who is blind, or identity first, I am a blind person. When speaking about your vision impairment, in your daily conversation, do you refer to it in a negative, neutral, or positive way? These are just some things to think about and be mindful of as Claire takes us through disclosure scripts. Just something for you to consider. So over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Maddie. Okay, so we're now going to think about how to create a disclosure script. And there are really 4 main steps around using a disclosure script with an employer. So let's just take a look at these steps. Step 1 really touches on the point that Maddie just raised. Step 1 is all about reflection. So reflecting on how you think and feel about your vision can help to inform how you might disclose this to others. So just take some time to clarify in your own mind first a simple description of your vision using positive language. Reflect on your strengths and capabilities for the role that you're applying for. Reflect on possible work tasks or situations where you need some supports or adjustments. For example, in the workplace, it might be around accessing information or communication with your colleagues, or perhaps moving around the workplace environment. Reflect on supports and adjustments that have worked for you in the past. You can also consider any supports and adjustments that might have been recommended to you by a vision advisor. So, for instance, someone from Vision Australia or Guide Dogs. And keep in mind your preferences on supports and adjustments in the workplace, because this is an open conversation you can have with your employer. So the second step of the disclosure script is to compose your script. So it will likely start with a simple opening. So as an example, you might say something along the lines of, I just wanted to take this opportunity to chat with you about my vision. You then might give a brief overview of your vision, and it can be a really simple short phrase. So for example, I have low vision, or I am a person who is blind. And perhaps think about that point that Maddie raised about what you're most comfortable with in terms of identity first or person first. Then you might lead into your strengths and capabilities in your script. So for example, in terms of this role, I have good organizational and interpersonal skills and work well in a team environment, which I know is a really important aspect to this role. You then might lead into possible work tasks where you may need some support or adjustments. So for example, in terms of accessing information, I find reading small print difficult. And the next aspect is to go into those supports and adjustments that you found effective in the past. For example, so I use assistive technology, which is provided through job access to access information and for online communication with my colleagues. And then we close off the disclosure script. This finishing statement is a way to finish your disclosure with the employer, but in a way that opens it up for future conversations. So for instance, you might say something along the lines of, I thought it might be useful to share this with you now. So if I were to get the role, we can work together on a few simple adjustments that will help me be most effective in the role. And I'm happy to discuss this with you further. The third step in your disclosure script creation is to rehearse your script. So it's really important that you become familiar with your script so that you can go to it or refer to it at any point during the recruitment or employment process where you feel comfortable to disclose your vision. And it can be really helpful to rehearse your script with a friend or a family member who can provide you with any feedback. And the final step is around the delivery of your script. So just really coming back to that point, remember that this is a personal choice. Disclosure can happen at many opportunities during the recruitment and employment process, and it can happen in written or verbal format. So perhaps useful to think about if and when you would like to disclose your vision to an employer for a particular role, and remembering that that purpose is really around effective advocacy and requesting the supports and adjustments that you need for a particular role. Okay, so now we know the steps to creating a disclosure script. Maddie and I are going to give a few examples of what this might look like. Over to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for taking us through those 4 steps to creating a script. And just so that we're aware of it now, we will be sending out a resource to everyone who attended today so that you do have those steps with you that you can refer to and practice yourself. And now we're going to talk you through some examples. But before we do jump into the examples, I would just like to say that we all have different vision, different levels of vision, even within our community. It's different for everybody. So we have some examples for you today, but they might not be your example. So the script that we have, the steps that we've provided you with today is you can make your own script. You don't need to follow exactly these examples unless one was, yes, that would really work for me. So the first example would be of someone who has a hidden disability, and they do require some assistive technology. And they're in the interview, and the interviewer has asked, is there anything else that we should know, or do you have any requirements for the role or any adjustments? This is an example response that someone could give. Yes, in the spirit of transparency, I feel that I should be upfront with some adjustments that will help me succeed and share my skills with the team at this organization. I have acquired vision loss, and I use assistive technology to access my computer, and I find it helpful in meetings to have any presentation slides sent to me ahead of time so that I can view it using my technology and equally contribute to the meeting. If I were to be successful, job access would be available to come out and do a workplace assessment and implement that technology for me. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, but I just wanted to let you know about that now before we move forward. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Maddie. So this example is moving into to a person where the vision might be more noticeable. So for instance, someone who perhaps uses a dog guide, who may have attended the interview and it's very noticeable to the employer that this person has blindness or low vision. So this example starts like this. This might be a good time for me to have a quick chat with you around some support I find useful in the workplace. I have experience of working in collaborative workspaces and developing good relationships with my colleagues, which I know is a really important aspect of the role. I have low vision and I use a dog guide to help me get around the environment. Guide Dogs Australia can help us to set up a permanent workstation alongside my colleagues. I thought it might be useful to share this with you now, so if I were to get the role, we can work together on a few simple adjustments that will help me be most effective in communicating with my team and getting around the workplace. Over to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Claire. So another example would be for someone who has maybe entered the job interview using a cane. This is something that they may say during that interview process. I just wanted to have a chat, take this opportunity to have a chat with you about my vision. As you've probably noticed, I used a cane to come in here today and I have vision loss. However, I can assure you that my organizational and interpersonal skills are solid and I work well within a team environment, which I know is an important aspect within this receptionist role. In terms of accessing information, I use assistive technology, which is provided through Job Access, and I'm currently engaged with providers in Melbourne who can support me and your organisation as I settle into the role. I thought it might be useful to share this with you now so that if I was successful in the role, we can work together on a few adjustments that will help me be most effective in the role. And I'm happy to continue the conversation about this with you. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Maddie. So this is our final example. And this example is around for someone who perhaps might need some supports or adjustments around communication with their colleagues, that kind of social aspect as well. So I just wanted to have a chat with you about a few supports that help me to be most effective in the workplace. I am a person who is blind and I use assistive technology for online team communications. In terms of communication supports, I find it really helpful when my colleagues introduce themselves when coming over to speak with me and roll calls in meetings so that I know who's present and who's absent in our team meetings. Just a few simple adjustments like these can be really useful for communicating with my team, and I'm happy to chat about this with you further. Okay, so those are just a few examples of how a disclosure script in the workplace context can run. And as Maddie said, these are just examples, and it's really important that your script reflects your personal situation and your strengths and your capabilities for that particular role. Okay, over to you, Maddie.
Thank you. So that does bring us to the end of our content today, and we will be opening up for some discussion and questions in just a moment. But before we do that, if you would like to have a one-on-one discussion with an eye to the future about your individual situation, we would welcome that conversation with you, and an expression of interest form will be sent to you along with a feedback survey at the end of this session. And we can support and guide you through the job searching and application process, interview skills, and creating your own disclosure script and be that person to listen to your practicing, which Claire mentioned before. It's important to rehearse your script. We can also be that person to listen and support you through that process. So we will be sending you a link if you'd like to register with an eye to the future at the end of this session, along with a handout to writing your own script. And as always, we are available via our email, bca@bca.org.au, or our phone number 1800 033 660. So if you would like to contribute in any way, you're more than welcome to pop yourself off mute. But before you do speak, please say your name so that we know who is contributing to the conversation. So if anybody has anything they'd like to say, we would love to hear from you.
Hello, I'm Debbie. Did I raise my hand or?
You're welcome to jump in. Thank you, Debbie.
Oh, thank you, Maddie. I've found this so invaluable. A lot of the things I was wanting to practice anyway about positivity, but one thing I picked up that is, yeah, I must admit I probably have always said I'm blind first, where it's interesting how you word it, like say I'm a person who is blind rather than I'm totally blind, because that unwittingly perhaps has become the identifier. So I certainly want to take that on board and change that perception, even unwittingly giving it, because it shouldn't be my identity that I'm blind. There's an identity. I like that. I think that's really good. But I wanted to question about, you mentioned about it's good to be able to come up with an alternative to say, well, instead of saying I can't drive, but to get around I can use a taxi or get assistance. But it brings me to the question about people who are on the NDIS scheme. Now, would that be considered it would be a necessary support? Like if you had to go somewhere but it's not just getting the taxi there, it's getting to around the premises. Like you might need to meet with a group of people and you've never been to the place before. Would that be an appropriate sort of thing to say, look, this is like the circumstances have changed, and use NDIS support funding for something like that would help within the job? Or is there another option to have maybe that sort of support, where you not just need a driver, but someone who could assist you to get around the premises? Thank you.
Thank you. And that's, it's a good question. You asked a few questions within your question. So in terms of the NDIS, I certainly don't want to give you recommendations on NDIS funding, but if it's within your plan, that's something that could be a conversation, and it might be something to have a inquiry with and investigate yourself before mentioning that to an employer. But if that is something that you can use within your employment space, that's really valuable to mention that at the same stage as the employer, the disclosure, so that you're giving that confidence. You know that these supports are available, and that's something the employer can go, this person knows what their supports are available. And then there's also the job access, who can give some guidance around what's available and what supports can help go from A to B. That might not be a taxi, but it could be how to O&M around the place. I'm not sure if Claire or Bettina would like to add on to that response, but great questions.
Thanks, Maddie. Yes, I agree. So in some cases, it's worth having that conversation with the NDIS prior to your disclosure, so that you can include that in there. There's also, I'm not sure whereabouts you are in Australia, but for instance, in New South Wales, they have a mobility service that you can investigate into, and that provides that that kind of transport support from getting A to B.
I'm in Bendigo, in Victoria.
Okay, so perhaps there might be something equivalent in the Victoria state to look into. So I know in New South Wales it's called Mobility Services, I think, and that can provide that support too if you can't access that through your NDIS funding as another option. And I think the other aspect to your question was around when you have to meet a group of colleagues, and that's a conversation that you can have with your employer around some adjustments. So making sure that there's a set time and a set place for you to meet your colleagues, and then those supports around perhaps them approaching you rather than you being expected to approach them. So having that open discussion with your employer, saying something along the lines of, You know, I find it really useful when I'm meeting with a group of colleagues, if we set a time and a specific place, and then if my colleague can approach me and say, hi, Debbie, you know, well, you know, and then off you go. That's another adjustment that you can have that conversation with your employer.
Because I was thinking more too, like if there was, say, a meeting you needed to attend personally to even another site, or maybe you go to a place that's not your work site, but you might be attending, I don't know, depending on what the role is that you're doing, if it was something that you might be required to, say, go, and I'm just thinking out of the box here, it might be something you might need to go to the state library, or you might need to go to KPMG, you know, building, or something that you wouldn't normally go to, but you might need to meet with some people. So what I guess I'm getting at is that you wouldn't want to, if that was part of the role, to do something like that from time to time. It would be good to sort of, you know, think of some solutions to how you might resolve that. So thank you. I was thinking more of that line of somewhere you wouldn't attend. You might only attend that once, but go somewhere totally unfamiliar.
Yes, yeah. So that's another good, so that would be, because it's within your role, as you've described it, that would be a conversation to have with your employer around supports for that. So
yes.
It could be that you call ahead to the place that you're visiting and talk to them around access and supports for you when you arrive. That might be one of the strategies. Or perhaps it might be that you're attending along with a colleague and you can work around adjustments in that case.
Yes, thank you. I wasn't just mentioning it for me. I thought it might be a useful strategy for everyone, you know, to sort of be that, because it's so easy to say, well, I don't know how I'll do that. And I thought, even myself, I wouldn't want to fall into that trap of that. It's good to sort of be always on the ready to come up with a solution, or in, you know, approach and positively. So thank you. That's really good thinking. It just gave me some food for thought in your talks this morning.
And that's really proactive of you, Debbie, as well. You know, thinking about those things, that's really important to have that mindset of, okay, this might come up, or I've experienced this before, and how am I going to navigate this in the future? I can see that Heidi has their hand up. So Heidi, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Well, thanks for this today. It's been great. And I was just thinking about the disclosure statement, and I'm in a position, and I don't know if others are in this as well. I was working full time until about 2 years ago, where my vision deteriorated. I've got retinitis pigmentosa. And just in terms of the disclosure statement, I am not 100% clear of what my needs are within a new job or a new place, as I haven't navigated this space before where I have had disclosure and my eyes are at this space and what my needs would be pertaining to a specific role. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to, in the disclosure statement, say, hey, I need this, because I don't quite know what it is as yet. So I could perhaps do a broad thing and say, look, I need assistive technology, etc. But I don't know how specific it would be, because I haven't done this before. So I think that's my one question, is how to frame that. And then the other thing is, I guess there were 3 things. And then the other thing is that I'm still in the process of learning the assistive technology. And I've got a funny feeling I'll be learning this for the rest of my life. So I think, how do I phrase that? And perhaps I'll ask for a one-on-one session. In fact, I will, because I think that, thank you so much for offering that, is how do I phrase that I'm still learning my AT, and I'm still learning about my vision impairment, and I'll still be learning about a new role at the same time. So there's those 2 things happening at the same time, lots of learning. Because I think I've come from a place where I thought I had to be super competent with the AT and how this all works before applying for a role. And now I'm learning that I'm not going to have this all worked out beforehand. I just am not. If I want that, I'll probably never be employed. And then the third piece is that with the acquired vision loss that I have, it keeps changing. And so my needs might change as well. So just those are the 3 muddle thoughts that come up. And there have been things that have really, and they felt to me like they've been barriers. And I was wondering how to put that in a disclosure statement, how to do that, and is that relevant? And just I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. So thanks.
Great questions. And this is something that, we had discussed as well, about, how for conditions that will change over time, approaching those. And I'll invite Claire to come back in with that, because we certainly discussed that together. But I did just want to quickly address the, you're learning your assistive technology. And I think you mentioned that's something you feel like you might always be learning. And that's, things change, technology changes, and we will always be learning our assistive technology and technology in general. And when we spoke about the positive language earlier in today's session, we did mention that instead of saying I can't, can we replace it with I can, or I'm learning to do, or I'm improving on my XYZ skills, whatever they might be. So say that you have a learning mindset, or always open to learning, or always working towards upskilling is quite valuable. So there's no harm in saying I'm learning, I'm upskilling, I'm investing in learning these skills. And then what's required for this role? Can I link any of that into the role to show that I'm really motivated for this role? And I'll, invite Claire or Bettina to also join in on this conversation. But I certainly wanted to pick up on the learning mindset. Having that positive language around something that is quite uncertain can be really important to give the employer confidence.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Heidi. I think they're really good questions. And I agree with Maddie. One of the things I picked up when you were talking was you were already kind of using positive language around I'm learning. So that's great. I would say, as Maddie's touched on, I think that's a really good asset to have and a really good mindset to be in when you're approaching these kind of conversations. And I just wanted to touch on, so you mentioned about the disclosure script and not really, given that your vision condition is changing, not necessarily knowing specifics within the disclosure script. And that might be true for people regardless of whether their vision condition is changing or not, because the reality is that part of the interview process is finding out more about the role and what will be involved. And so going in with a disclosure script that has that broad overview, as you said, just a simple broad overview, can be enough to open up the conversation, because the disclosure script is not the end game, it's the starting point. It's your conversation opener, and that conversation starts with your disclosure, perhaps using your disclosure script, and it's one that will continue throughout your employment. So as different job tasks come up or different work situations arise, these are open conversations you'll have with your employer at the time. And you can go to them and say, I'm aware that this is a requirement, or I need to perform this job task. I would like to talk to you about a few adjustments, and that can happen at any point during the employment process. So the disclosure script is that kind of overview, and where you can give some examples. Much of the adjustments and supports are conversations that you will have ongoing with your employer throughout your employment. So don't feel like it's a barrier at all. It's perfectly natural for all of us.
We did have something come through in the chat, which I will say to everyone, and then we can also respond to that. So one person, Kinza, has asked, I don't know if it's only me or others feel the same. I fear the interviewing team will not hire me after knowing about my vision issue, even though I'm perfectly capable for the role. So that's a really, really legitimate concern. And it's something that I think is at the forefront of a lot of our minds when we talk about disclosure is, will I be discriminated against if I do disclose, or they won't hire me if I do disclose? And that's something that Bettina touched on at the start of the session around the rights. And what I didn't mention at the start of our workshop, but I will take the opportunity to mention now, is today is the first of a 3-part workshop series for job seekers around job readiness. today has been about disclosure scripts, because that's something that is at the forefront of a lot of our minds when we think about the job search, as we think about our vision and how that's going to impact. The next two workshops that we're going to be having, one is around cover letter and resume preparation, and the other is around job interview preparation. And there's opportunities for disclosure at various stages, and we're going to be talking through the pros and cons of disclosing at each stage and disclosing at all. This is a conversation that will continue throughout the conversation that we have over the next workshops, but we will be going into that in a little bit more detail around the pros and cons of the timing of disclosure. If you choose to disclose, the pros and cons to the timing is something that we are going to be covering in the next workshops over the next couple of months. Claire, was there anything else you'd like to add to that? Thank you, Kinza.
No, I think you've said it really well, which is, I think it's a fear that, or, you know, a very legitimate concern that we can all have when we go into these types of situations. And yes, the next two workshops will help unpick that kind of pros and cons around the timing of disclosure. So yeah, I would say come along to our next workshops, and this is a conversation that will certainly continue on.
And I think that is bringing us to almost a close, unless there's any final comments. We will be circulating a feedback survey to everyone who attended, and we would really appreciate any feedback that you have. We will also be sending you through a written document on the disclosure script, which you might find helpful to inform you in your disclosure script. And we will also be providing you with a link to register with an Eye to the Future, so that we can have conversations with you one-on-one about your situation, or answer any questions that you might have, or hopefully support you in your job searching and success. So thank you everybody for coming along today. Thank you for your contributions, your questions, and we hope you found it useful. And that brings us to a close. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Have a great day.
That concludes today's webinar. You can find out more at eyetothefuture.com.au. An Eye to the Future is an initiative of Blind Citizens Australia, informing, connecting, and empowering Australians who are blind or vision impaired.